So, I'm really delighted to have Julie come and talk to us today. Julie and I met under slightly interesting circumstances.
It's not as interesting as it's going to sound.
We were both external examiners at a PhD a few months ago, which turned out to be a less than positive experience, unfortunately, mainly unfortunate for the candidate. But anyway, we certainly bonded. And have a very strong mutual interest in children's play and its relationship to development and so on. And so we had quite a conversation about Julie's work and what we're doing in Pedal and so on. So I'm delighted that she's been able to come today and to share some of her work with us. Okay. I'm very jealous of the fact that she works in Chester because it's absolutely my favourite zoo in the whole world. But she tells me that the college is very similar. So. Okay, so over to you. Julie's going to talk for about an hour, and then normally what we do these things is have the talk for about an hour, and then we've got sort of 20 minutes or so at the end for questions. Okay, so do store up the interesting questions as we go on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for having me as well. As David said, we kind of met through a mutual interest in the role of play in children's learning and development. My background is my PhD was about the relationships between children's play, language and drawing, particularly their symbolic development. And as part of my PhD, which was at the University of Manchester, I was really interested in looking at the effect of different educational curriculums upon language, drawing and play. But the work that I'm going to talk about specifically today is just focusing upon play and creativity. I'm going to apologise in advance that I kind of got a bit over-enthusiastic with my slides and I've produced far too many for the hour slot that I've got. So I'm going to get through as much as I can and I may have to miss out a little bit at the end. First off, I just wanted to thank the participants who took part in the research that I'm going to present today. So that's all of the children and the schools that participated, undergraduate and postgraduate psychology students at the University of Chester who helped to collect data. My PhD, one of my PhD supervisors, Evan Kidd, who's now at the University of La Trobe in Australia, who also does interesting research around language and play-based learning. And some other collaborators, Andrew Stewart at Manchester University, Julian Lloyd at the University of Chester, who's been involved in helping me with developing the scale that I might get to talk briefly about, I might not. And David as well, for inviting me here today and for being a really positive influence in the Viva that we did as well. It was a really good learning experience for me. So I'm going to talk briefly about the importance of play within a cultural learning approach, and I'm kind of knowing that I'm talking to you as people who will be converted to the importance of play as well, so I'm not going to have to push it too much. To talk about the influence particularly of Steiner and Montessori schooling upon pretense and creativity. So I know there's a few people in the room who potentially practice within those systems, and I'm definitely not an expert in those areas. The study that I did was really a small-scale exploratory study to kind of start to investigate some of the issues and to provide a more quantitative grounding. I'm going to look briefly at the relationship between pretense and creativity, and then consider how childhood fantasy play might be related to later adult functioning. So hopefully this will prove interesting. So just briefly, the importance of play and creativity. Obviously, play takes up a lot of children's unstructured time within Western societies. And creativity and play seem to be intrinsically linked with each other as well. So if you think about a playful, creative mindset, we might think of childhood as being indicative of that. And the role and importance of play is enshrined within the UN Convention on Human Rights and also within certain educational curricula as well. So the role of play as a form of a learning mechanism is within the early years foundation stage documentation. The extent to which that carries on into Key Stage 1 and beyond, and ideas about the kind of more formal pressures of formal didactic learning filtering down into the EYFS, we can kind of debate and think about. But I think within Western societies, it's generally accepted as being an important means through which children learn. So there's lots of different types of play and different play types, and you may be aware of the different definitions of how we might define play, and this with it itself is very contested. So can you even measure play skills empirically? It's quite difficult, because if you think about the 4 characteristics of play, for example, proposed by Krasner and Pepler, they are flexibility, that it varies in form and affect, that it's generally associated with positive affect, so children find it fun. It's intrinsically motivated, so children take part in it because they want to and because they choose to. One of the criticisms you might level at empirical research is that if you're asking children to take part in a play task, is that really intrinsically motivated? And I think that's an issue that probably applies to a lot of research in this area. One of the forms of play that I'm particularly interested in is pretend play. So that's play that involves a non-literal aspect to it. So a transformation of reality, so pretending as if something is something else. So I might pretend that a chair is a battleship, for example, or I might attribute pretend qualities to a teddy bear. So I might pretend that a teddy is sad, for example. And this type of pretend play, which is sometimes called symbolic play, so potentially using an object to symbolize something else, and fantasy or role play, so taking on roles in the play, such as pretending to be a nurse or a doctor. This type of play specifically has been associated with developmental benefits and is argued to be particularly important for children. And it's particularly been argued to be important within a cultural learning approach within psychology. So many of you may have heard of Vygotsky as one of the main developmental theorists. You might have heard of the work of Michael Tomasello, whose work has kind of continued on from Vygotsky's kind of social constructivist approach. So cultural learning is the idea that humans learn through cultural activities, through socialization, and particularly through symbols which we use to internalize knowledge. So to Vygotsky particularly, that was through language. But he also argued that play was particularly important for children's development and created a zone of proximal development in which children can achieve their highest level of potential. And he was one of the theorists to argue that symbol use and pretend play is particularly important to cognitive development. So in cognitive development, children can develop higher level abstract thought processes. So he argued particularly that object substitution in pretense is important. So if a child uses a block and pretends that it's a car, he argued that that shows a higher level of cognitive functioning because they're aware of what the block is in reality, but they're also attributing a symbolic status to it as well. So within the research, that's what's called the dual representational problem. So the child understands that it's an object in reality, but it's also representing something else symbolically as well. So you've got the start of abstract thought where you're disconnecting thought from concrete objects in front of you. So in this little picture here, this little boy is pretending that the colander is a hat, for example. So Michael Tomasello and colleagues would argue that pretend play is important to development. So it's an indicator of cognitive flexibility and cognitive functioning. And to be able to engage in pretense, you must have knowledge about the real world first. So to be able to pretend to be a doctor or a nurse, I have to understand what those concepts are and what people within those roles do. So children might really show their true level of understanding in pretend play. And it's also evident within the research literature that we might consider that the absence of pretense during early childhood is problematic. So the absence of pretend play can be considered as one of the indicators of autism spectrum disorder, for example. So within this cultural learning approach, pretend play is important to children's cognitive functioning. Related to play is the concept of creativity. So although play and creativity are notoriously difficult to define, and you could probably spend days, arguing over the intricacies or how they're defined within the literature, they seem to share several characteristics. So within pretend play and within creativity, you might have aspects of fantasy, so as if, non-literal thought. You have flexibility of thought, divergent thinking, where the kind of cliched way of describing that is thinking outside of the box or thinking of multiple solutions to a particular problem. So thought is flexible and it's also open as well, so open and flexible to new ideas. So a lot of the research suggests that play and creativity are positively related to each other. So if you show high levels of creativity, you may also show high levels of pretend play or more complex pretend play as well. And the research suggests that for children, that's not just concurrently, but also longitudinally over time. So pretense and creativity may predict each other over time during childhood. So this is where the idea of some research that I'll talk about later. Are children who engage in more fantasy play more creative as adults? Is there a kind of longitudinal link there? However, pretense and creativity are not valued within all cultures. So you might recognise this man here, which is Richard Dawkins. There was an article, I think, last year, a couple of years ago, where he argued that fairy tales are harmful to children because they enculturate them into supernatural beliefs. And this is also similar in some cultures. Myths like Father Christmas, for example, are not encouraged or not accepted because they're seen as lying to children. So pretense isn't encouraged or accepted across all cultures. And surprisingly, Piaget, some of his views was that pretense, particularly in early childhood, he saw it as an indicator of egocentrism. So particularly what he called the primacy of assimilation over accommodation. So he argued that in pretend play, children consolidate existing skills but don't necessarily learn new skills. So his views were quite in opposition to those of Vygotsky. So to Piaget, play becomes more useful and more complex when it starts to be governed by rules from middle childhood onwards. So pretend play isn't accepted or valued in all societies or cultures. And education is one aspect of culture that might have an influence upon how pretense and creativity develop. So within a cultural learning approach within psychology, it's argued that the culture in which you are raised and the value that is placed on particular skills might influence the development of those skills. So I particularly became interested in Steiner schooling system in particular because of the value that it places on arts and drawing in comparison to the national curriculum. And there have been quite a few studies that have looked at Steiner schools compared to mainstream schools and have found that Steiner school pupils perform better in tests of realistic drawing and also of creative drawing as well. And the reason I was interested in these different areas was a cultural learning approach would hypothesize that these being brought up in a particular education system may have an influence on the development of these skills. So in some ways, being educated within alternative education systems is kind of a naturally occurring test of a cultural learning hypothesis. So you might hypothesize that being brought up or being educated in school systems which differ in their attitudes towards pretense might have an influence upon children's pretense abilities and their creativity. So that was the general idea behind this part of my PhD. I'm going to run through very briefly about what Montessori and Steiner school systems are, but I'm very aware that you're probably not going to get the best view, or I can't give the most accurate view doing this quite quickly, because they're quite complicated systems with different underpinning philosophies than within the national curriculum. The reason I was motivated to do this research was because there wasn't very much empirical research comparing children's abilities in each of these educational systems. So there was some qualitative or more anecdotal research, but if there was an argument to try and bring aspects of these education systems into the public state school system, then governments increasingly are looking for quantitative or statistical evidence, which I'm aware there are limitations of, but that was the idea, to try and give some empirical support for these approaches. So Montessori was developed by Maria Montessori, who developed it as a system for children, underprivileged children in Italy. So although it's often associated now with the middle classes in the UK, it was developed for underprivileged children. And in other countries in the world, it's incorporated into the state school system. Within the UK, they are mostly private fee-paying schools. Just to briefly go over some of the key features of Montessori. So has anyone here, does anyone have experience with Montessori or know kind of the key aspects of Montessori? Just put your hand up if you do. So there's a few people, so hopefully I'm going to give as I said, I'm not an expert in the area, but hopefully I'm going to give a fairly accurate kind of summary. So Montessori was particularly interested in how children learn through activity and through exploration. So in some ways it mirrors Piaget's kind of constructive approach to cognitive development. And she particularly argued that children learn best through action with specially designed materials. So within the Montessori curriculum, she designed a set of specialist materials that were designed to facilitate learning in particular areas, and also to give fairly abstract concepts a concrete basis. So particularly in terms of mathematics, for example, it's argued to really help children's development. So some of the specialist sensorial materials, so the idea that children learn through the senses, are displayed here. So, for example, the wooden cylinders, the task here is for children to put the wooden cylinders in the correct size holes. Or with the pink blocks, by lining these up in order, they start to learn basic mathematical concepts, such as volume and size, for example. But they're learning these things relatively unconsciously through discovery learning. So specialist kind of concrete materials through which children learn, and the idea that children and learning should be internally rather than externally motivated. So people should learn because they're interested in what they're learning rather than because they're being told to learn something. So within the Montessori environment, there's freedom of choice to a certain extent of what activities children choose to do. So the sensory materials are organised kind of in a sequence of difficulty. So children are watched by the Montessori teachers or facilitators, so they can't just repeat the same task over and over again, but to a certain extent they have choice when they come in the morning over what activities they want to do. So it's more kind of self-directed learning. And the teacher is more there as a guide rather than a didactic kind of instructor. So within Montessori classrooms, you also have mixed age groupings. So the idea is that although children will do these tasks on their own to a certain extent, they can also learn from their peers as well. So sometimes within the literature, Montessori has been seen as, some people have argued that it's kind of the child being an individual exploratory scientist and that it's quite a lonely learning experience. But my experience of doing research in Montessori's wasn't like that at all. There was very much a lot of social interaction, but children also had the time to choose and focus upon the activities that they wanted to do. The range of this study was just looking at pretense and creativity, but there is research in the area that's starting to emerge that suggests that Montessori children have better executive function abilities. So they have better ability to maintain levels of concentration, for example. So the Montessori classroom is also, if you walk into a Montessori classroom, it also looks quite different. So the materials are kind of child-sized and child-based and generally made of wooden material so that they're warm to touch and to handle, and painted in bright colours to make them attractive to children as well, to encourage them to explore. One aspect of Montessori curriculum that I was particularly interested in was the fact that in Montessori's original viewpoint, she kind of agreed with Piaget in arguing that pretense specifically, so not play in general, not play-based learning, but pretense could be harmful to children and that it involved the suspension of reality. And she argued that rather than engaging in pretense, children should be able to engage with the real world and engage in real-life practical activities. So she argued that in her observations, children wanted to be able to take part in the adult world and to be able to cook, etc., rather than doing that in a pretend manner. And she argued that in doing this, children learn important aspects about community, socialisation, and moral responsibility as well. So in Montessori schools, children are doing practical real-life activities that maybe you wouldn't necessarily see children doing in mainstream schools. So when I first arrived at one of the Montessori schools in Brighton, the children were cleaning off the tables and cleaning the chairs as well. So there was an emphasis upon practical real-life activities because of the idea that pretense might distort or subvert children's understanding of the real world. And because of this, traditionally in Montessori education, there's been a lack of provision for pretend play specifically. So if you go into an early years classroom, you would see a home corner, for example, that might have dolls and a kitchen, etc. Traditionally within Montessori, that hasn't necessarily been the case. And there are anecdotal reports where if children try to use the sensorial materials in a way that's not their intended function, that a facilitator may step in and encourage them to use them in the way that they were designed. So, for example, if a child was pretending that the pink blocks were animals in a zoo, for example. And as I'll talk about in a moment, I think this really varies across different schools. But that's kind of the main kind of traditional idea. So as I'm saying here, I think this very traditional view might be in quite stark contrast to what we as educators think about pretense in Western development kind of today. And I think Montessori practitioners are starting to talk more about the value of pretense. And there's a researcher in America called Angeline Lillard, who's really big a researcher in the area of play in general, but who's also involved in Montessori education and has done quite a few studies in the area. And she argues that although Montessori might not necessarily involve pretense, it involves a play-based approach. So what she means by that is that it involves a lot of the attributes of play-based learning. So not necessarily pretense, but involves aspects such as freely chosen activities. So in the classroom, Montessori children can choose what activities they want to learn. It involves peer involvement, like play, intrinsic rewards rather than externally motivated rewards. So Montessori doesn't necessarily use grades, for example, or standardized tests. It also involves objects, as you would in sensory motor play. So she argues that although Montessori doesn't necessarily involve pretense, it involves a lot of the characteristics of a play-based approach in general. And interestingly, she published an article which was in Science, which is a huge journal, that found that Montessori pupils in America showed some more developed social skills than children in mainstream schools within that society. So particularly reasoning about particular playground dilemmas. So their reasoning about how those might be solved was more advanced than children who were educated in mainstream schools. So Montessori seemed to show a system that although it values exploratory activity and learning, obviously was not as positive about the role of pretense specifically within development. And Steiner education is really in kind of contrast to that approach. So Steiner schools again were developed by a particular individual, Rudolf Steiner. They are a really popular form of alternative schooling system across the world, although in Scandinavian countries they're part of the state schooling system. So schools in the UK can educate in the Steiner approach from preschool through to 16 years of age. So one of the schools where I did my PhD research was Edinburgh Steiner School, which provides for children from early years through to A level. And again, most of these schools within the UK are largely private schools, so parents have to pay for their children to attend. Although there is a school in Hereford who has, I've forgotten the word now, has been kind of been brought into the public sector. I have forgotten the word, but yeah, free school, that's the one.
Is that actually an academy? There are 3 new free schools as well now, so there's actually 4.
Brilliant, thank you. So there, at the time, I think there's an increasing move to try and bring Steiner within the kind of public sector. And that's why for this research I thought it was really important to start to try and have some quantitative basis for doing that. The Steiner curriculum is kind of focused around stages in childhood and the idea that different sort of children have different ways of learning within those different stages. So within early childhood, there's really the primacy of imitation and play in learning. So similar to Scandinavian systems, that prior to 7 years of age, children are experiencing a play-based approach to learning. And even during middle childhood, there's an emphasis upon learning through imagination and through feeling as well. So there's an emphasis upon imagination and creativity for much longer than you see within the national curriculum. So within the national curriculum, we see a focus on play within the early years foundation stage, but arguably once children get into Key Stage 1, there's a much more focus upon didactic kind of learning and instruction. And there is a big movement in the UK called the Saving Childhood movement that is looking at trying to get a play-based approach for longer within the UK, like within Steiner and Montessori kind of schooling systems. So both Steiner and Montessori cover all subjects that you would find within the national curriculum, but also additional subjects as well. So I think Montessori covers aspects such as citizenship and world knowledge. And what I saw from Steiner schools was that they also cover subjects such as knitting, gardening and eurythmy, which I think is the kind of the art of movement through dance. And knitting, it's useful, it's interesting from a developmental perspective because you could argue that it develops the fine and gross motor skills that are involved in later writing ability. And interestingly, Vygotsky argued a similar point, that drawing provides those foundational skills for emergent writing as well. So when I teach my students about Montessori and Steiner, I very much get them to see how Vygotsky's, Piaget's views are evident within these alternative education systems, just as they are within the national curriculum. And I think what Steiner does really well is that children learn through a multiple symbol systems approach. So there isn't as much emphasis upon numeracy and literacy in the way that we see it in the national curriculum. There's an emphasis upon learning through a variety of mediums, so through dance, through plays, through pretend play and play itself, and also through oral recitation as well. So there's more of an emphasis upon expressive language skills prior to learning to read and to write. So, and that's supported by some psychological research which suggests that activities like play give children a foundation in their phonological awareness, which may then be a building block to later literacy skills. So Steiner education is an active and integrated curriculum in which art, play, movement and nature are highly valued. Again, it's child-centred and children are taught in developmentally appropriate ways. So the idea that play is developmentally appropriate for children within early years and even into middle childhood as well. So the idea that we shouldn't force children to become cognitive beings too quickly. We should allow them to develop at a social and emotional level first before bringing in kind of formal instruction. And again, there's more collaborative learning where children learn in mixed age classrooms, so they can learn through their peers as well as through the teacher. And again, if you walk into a Steiner school, I found that the Steiner school environment was very different. So again, there's lots of natural materials. Because of the emphasis upon art, the walls tend to be covered in drawings and graphic productions, the teachers as well as the children's. So I think art is much more valued than it is within the national curriculum, where when I've been into national curriculum schools, and I'm not sure if people will agree with this, but often children are asked to do a drawing alongside a story, for example, and whereas the story is marked, there's very little attention given to the drawing that they've produced. So it's kind of not valued in as high a way as numeracy and literacy. So there's a very kind of warm and homely feel to these classrooms as well. And in terms of activities, you can see the eurythmy teaching, a lot of engagement and play outside in terms of being aware of and interested in nature, and learning through about physics through nature, for example. Pottery, drawing, knitting, and acting, and pretense and role play as well. So that seemed to suggest that Steiner education highly values and promotes play, and particularly pretend play. And Steiner classrooms tend to lack the kind of conventional manufactured toys that you would see in an early years environment. And what's interesting from a cultural learning perspective is you might argue that if children have to use non-representational materials to play with, that might promote abstract thought and higher levels of cognitive thinking at a younger age. So, but this kind of pretend play is still prioritised into middle childhood as well. So this kind of set the basis for this first study that I wanted to look at. And there wasn't a lot of research in the area, particularly quantitative research. There was some qualitative research, and I think qualitative research is really beneficial. I think some of the advantages about using statistical analysis is that you can start to make some generalizations from your data, and therefore governments who are providing funding may be, they may be looking for that kind of evidence, although there's limitations with quantitative data as well. There was little research that compared abilities across those three systems. So there were some studies that looked at Montessori compared to mainstream or mainstream compared to Steiner, but very few studies that looked at all three systems. And those studies that did look at three systems were looking at children's drawings abilities. So there wasn't much research at the time, which was 5 years ago, looking into other areas, although that's starting to develop. So there is some research now that's starting to look at literacy outcomes within the different systems. But there wasn't any research looking particularly at pretense, which seemed interesting given the fact that Steiner and Montessori seem to be quite contrasting viewpoints on that issue. There was a study in America that looked at pretend play in Montessori and mainstream schools, and was looking at the amount of pretend play that children engaged in and the complexity of their play, and also the amount of private speech that they engaged in. So private speech is where children talk to themselves, and it's a phenomenon that you see during early childhood, arguably before it becomes internalized to become inner thought completely. And this study found that children in the Montessori schools were engaging in less pretend play, less complex play, and lower levels of private speech as well. So that's interesting. If we place a large emphasis upon pretense, and we argue that it has an empirical basis for being connected to children's other abilities, then a system which doesn't encourage that, it might be quite interesting to look at what the developmental outcomes are. So that was the indication for pretense, and similarly, there was minimal research kind of looking at creativity across the three different school systems as well. And the research that had been conducted tended to find that Steiner schools pupils showed higher levels of creativity. Although this study by Lillard and Alsquest found that Montessori children in their sample showed higher levels of verbal creativity or narrative storytelling. So that was the basis for what myself and Evan wanted to research. So it was a very much a preliminary investigation or a pilot study looking at creativity and pretense across the three systems. And I'm quite careful to say that it wasn't a large-scale study. So there was 20 children in each play system. But we did measure, I'm not included in this talk, but we did measure creativity, pretense, language abilities, and drawing abilities, and non-verbal ability. So the children themselves had to take part in a lot of tests. So it took quite a long time to collect the data. And we thought this was theoretically important within a developmental and educational perspective, but also pedagogically as well, in terms of providing some kind of support for different education systems. And we also looked at re-examining the relationship between pretense and creativity as well. So the idea that if children are more engaged in more pretense, are they also more creative as well? So based upon the different educational systems, we predicted that the Steiner pupils would perform best on the measures of creativity and pretense, that the national curriculum pupils would fall in the middle, and that the Montessori pupils would perform least well based upon the literature that we'd reviewed. So what we wanted to do was to collect this data and statistically test our hypotheses. What you're probably thinking at the moment, or what I would be thinking if someone was doing this, was how on earth did you measure pretense and creativity? And I'm going to come on to that in a moment. And the measures that we use, there are limitations, and I'll be perfectly upfront about that from the start. So we're trying to remember that this was really a pilot study. So we had 60 children between the ages of 6 years, 10 months, and 8 years, 11 months, so middle childhood, within each school type. We had 4 Montessori schools take part, 2 Steiner schools, and 2 mainstream schools. Those mainstream schools followed the national curriculum, but were private schools. We thought that was particularly important because parents who send their children to Steiner or Montessori schools have made an active decision to send their children to those schools and are paying fees for their children to attend those schools as well. So to try and control to a certain extent differences in parental motivations, we used private mainstream schools, and obviously that limits the generalisability of the findings to a certain extent. All the children have been taught within their current school from around 4 years of age. So they'd been there between 2 to 4 years. And again, there are limitations with that. Ideally, you'd want to do a much longer scale, longitudinal study. But anyone who's doing a PhD at the moment, you've only got 3 years, so you've got to wrap it up within that time. And there were a relatively equal number of males and females within each school type. So in an attempt to match the samples from each of the school systems, we tried to match them on age. So statistically, there were no significant differences between the mean ages of the children in the 3 samples. We also measured socio-economic status of the area in which the children were being educated, which was based on mean household income for the postcode, which again is limited to a certain extent, but gives you some kind of indication of socio-economic status. We did find that there was a significant difference there, that the socio-economic status of the Montessori schools was higher than the Steiner and the national curriculum schools. So we had to kind of take that into account in the analyses. We also measured children's non-verbal ability. So the Raven's coloured progressive matrices we used to measure non-verbal ability. And again, there were some statistical differences between the non-verbal ability of the 3 age groups. So what we did, and again with language, there were some differences between the samples. So what we did was we entered those as control variables into the analyses. So basically to make sure that any differences in pretense and creativity were not due to the differences in language and non-verbal ability that we measured. So it was attempting to be as stringent as possible in the results that we reported. But obviously, unfortunately, that did mean that there were quite a lot of tests. And this also kind of affected what we could, the kind of pretense and creativity measures that we could use as well. So the schools that we were testing in, understandably, were not particularly open to us video recording the children. So we needed to use a measure of pretense that was used within the literature that had kind of valid and reliable measures of reliability, but which didn't involve video recording the children. So the measure that we used is called the Pretend Actions task. And it basically assesses the progression from representation based upon using a concrete signifier towards more truly symbolic symbolization. So what I mean by that basically was the children are asked to perform 6 different pretend actions. So you ask them to pretend to comb their hair, to pretend to drink from a cup, and to pretend to brush their teeth. So those are internally directed pretense actions. And then externally directed pretend actions, you give the child a wooden block and you ask them to pretend to cut it with a knife, to hammer it, and to cut it with a pair of scissors. And in terms of looking at the complexity of pretense, we were looking at whether they used a body part to represent the object, or whether they made reference to an absent object. So if you think back to what I was talking about earlier, using completely absent reference is a slightly more developed form of pretense than making reference to using part of your body to symbolise that object. And the advantage of this was that it was quick to administer and it didn't involve video recording, and the children were quite happy to do it as well. So I spent some time getting to know the children in the schools before we actually did this, because you can imagine that there's an aspect of embarrassment if somebody asks you to do something like that. The test of creativity, we used a standardised measure of creativity, which has been standardised across a large population of child and adult participants, that's called the test of creative thinking drawing production. So basically, children are asked to complete this graphic production in any way that they want to. So you instruct them that there's no right way or wrong way to finish the picture. They just finish it in the way that they want to finish it. And then the drawing is scored by independent raters who are blind to the school that the child has attended and to their age and gender, using 14 different scoring criteria. I know I'm kind of low on time, so I'm not going to go through all the criteria, but just to give you an example, some of the criteria are whether they use the fragments in their completion, and whether the way that they use the fragments is stereotypical or original. So within a large sample of people, stereotypical or less creative ways of completing them are, for example, to make the circle into a face or into a sun. So it kind of takes those any more less common completions into account. What I also show to my students, and they find it quite funny, is one of the criteria is whether you go outside the boundary of the large square. So one aspect of creativity is being willing in some ways to flout social conventions. So it's literally going outside the box. And whether they use this little fragment here and incorporate that into their graphic production as well. So we had the drawings rated by trained raters who were independent to the school types and had been trained on the criteria. And their levels of agreement were acceptable. So they agreed on 82 out of 120 of the drawings. And for the remaining pictures, their disagreement was only by within 4 points. So that's acceptable within the administration of the test. So what did we find? So you can see here the means and the standard deviations on the scores by school type. And when we conducted statistical analyses to look whether there were statistically significant differences between these scores, i.e. whether they differed more than you would expect by chance, we also put the non-verbal and language abilities into the analyses as covariates to kind of control for them. And what we found was that there was a significant effect of school type on the pretend actions. But what was interesting was that the only contrast that was significant was that the Steiner school children performed significantly better than the Montessori children. However, there was no significant difference between the Steiner children or the national curricula children or the Montessori children and the national curriculum children. So it was quite specific findings. It was quite different to what we hypothesized we would find. In terms of the creativity measures, you can see some of the example drawings here. This drawing is from a Steiner school pupil. So they're asked to give their drawing a label if they want to as well. So what the statistical analyses showed that the Steiner school children performed significantly better than both the Montessori and the national curriculum students, who didn't vary significantly from each other. So it was quite interesting in terms of those findings, in that there seemed to be some effects of the educational systems, but not necessarily in the way that we had hypothesised. So how we try to explain those is a matter that I'll come on into in a minute. We also looked at the relationship between Pretence and Creativity scores in the whole sample, independent of school type. And what we found was that there was a significant small positive correlation in the whole sample. I'm going to have to hurry up a bit. So basically, in this sample, children who were better at Pretence also scored more highly on creativity as well. So it was a small scale study, but it found some interesting results that seemed to suggest that these education systems might have an influence. So in particular, that the Steiner school system seems to be particularly conducive to creativity. And given that creativity is an indicator of cognitive flexibility and associated with other cognitive skills such as originality and problem solving, that seems particularly important and fits in with anecdotal reports that children who go to Steiner schools are independent thinkers, they're self-motivated, and even if they don't do standardised tests, they tend to do well when they go on to do degree qualifications. And that might be because of the multiple symbol systems approach that is used to teaching children within those systems. What was also interesting was that the Montessori children and the national curriculum children performed similarly. So the absence of pretence in the Montessori system didn't seem to have an influence upon their pretend abilities, even though there was a relationship between pretence and creativity in the sample as a whole. And we thought potentially this might be because of the comparative softening potentially of the traditional Montessori approach in actual practice. But it might also be that potentially while Steiner facilitates aspects of creativity that relate to the arts, and therefore they performed well in a drawing-based measure of creativity, potentially Montessori schooling promotes creativity in other areas, which may be better measured through more scientific or executive functioning tasks. And I think what this really told us was that there is a need for further longitudinal research with much larger sample sizes, and ideally supported by in-depth qualitative observational research that tells us what actually is going on within those schools as well. In terms of pretence, we argued that potentially the lack of any influence from the Montessori approach may be because these approaches are not restrictive. So potentially Montessori children engage in pretence during their break times and at home. And Montessori wasn't negative against pretend play in general, just not a part of formal classroom teaching. And here's where the influence of parental attitudes might be particularly important. And I think what would be really interesting would be to do a survey of parental attitudes towards pretence and the role of pretence in learning in these different school systems. And even, I think, generally within the national curriculum and early years education as well, to find out what parents actually think about the role of play and why, or if they think it's important. So I am going to finish in a minute. So in terms of why the Montessori pupils performed less well, particularly in the pretend actions task, we thought it may be because of the Montessori emphasis upon cognition in action, and particularly through the use of concrete sensory materials as well. So maybe this encourages Montessori pupils, maybe it encouraged them to use more iconic gestures or actions rather than truly symbolic actions. But I think, again, a large-scale study looking at gesture use and symbolic development within these different systems would be really interesting and would be a really nice PhD for somebody to do. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to do that anymore. So overall, that was what I did as part of my PhD, and it's really led me on to some of the research that I've carried on doing, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today. But what I have been looking at is, if there's relationship between pretense and creativity, and they are positively related, what are the aspects of pretense that might be most facilitative of creativity? So in particular, we did a project with one of my master's students that looked at the cognitive and affective components of pretend play, and which of those components best predict creative performance. And I'm also in the process of developing a measurement scale that attempts to measure people's predisposition towards fantasy play as a child. So there's a lack of standardized measurements that look or try to measure fantasy play from a retrospective point of view. And there are questionnaire scales that measure fantasy proneness in general, but the problem with those scales is that they tend to include items that don't relate to play in particular. So fantasy play, quantitative measurement scales like the, inventory of childhood memories and imaginings, they also ask questions of things about belief in supernatural beings. So they're not specific to pretend play in particular. And they're also very lengthy scales as well. And whilst it would be preferable to do a longitudinal study looking at how people who engage in a lot of pretense as children, how that follows them through the life course, I don't think it's going to be possible to get funding to do that anytime soon. So in the meantime, having a validated psychometric instrument that might reliably measure that predisposition and could then be used to potentially look at predictions over the lifespan might be a suitable alternative. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll have some time for some questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I just wondered what your attitude towards fairy stories is, or traditional stories is, because my thinking is that Richard Dawkins is not looking at the fact that they are based in reality, and some very harsh things, which sort of are exciting to children as well, have happened in the past, like barter and Jack and Beanstalk, and allowing your children to wander off if you can't afford to keep them, and those in the wood and things like that.
Yeah.
So I've loved doing in drama, using the drama, so I'm just interested to know what you think.
Definitely. I mean, I think the reason I came into this area, like a lot of other people in this room, because I'm really passionate about pretend play and play in general, and I think it's a really important way in which children learn. And when I think back, I think, for example, fairy tales have been an important part throughout history and culture about teaching children about morality, for example, and how to treat other people. And I think through storytelling and through pretense and through fairy stories, for example, children internalise those kind of moral codes. But also I think fairy tales I think they are associated with creativity. I can remember writing, one of the research areas I'm interested in is children's imaginary friends as well, and also the creation of paracosms, imaginary worlds. And you see that a number of writers, for example, who had imaginary friends as children and go on to develop whole imaginary worlds, like Tolkien, for example. I found a piece of paper when I was at home where I'd drawn, it was a map for something called Fairyland, which I must have drawn when I was at primary school, and thinking about how that showed, my literacy at that particular age. And to be honest, it was probably more imaginative than anything I could produce now, which is kind of a shame, I think. I can understand where people are coming from with sort of things like Father Christmas, in that when children find out that Father Christmas isn't real, that can be a potentially negative situation. But I think trading that off with maybe the positive emotions and the magic that it gives to children, I think I'd be prepared to have that trade-off.
Yes, thank you. Yes, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, that was fascinating. I was particularly interested to hear that Montessori was initially developed for the benefit of disadvantaged children. And it now seems at odds with the very specific learning aids that are involved and teachers needing to learn a particular methodology. So I just wondered why you thought that might be the case, why there had been this change, and if you think there were maybe differences in the early forms of Montessori that could have enabled it to be delivered for low-income groups.
I mean, I'm definitely not a Montessori expert, and I think the fact that they tend to be private schools in the UK is not actually the fault of the Montessori approach or philosophy. I think it's more because in the UK we perhaps haven't been as open to alternative education systems, and indeed the Montessori approach has been implemented in a school in Manchester, in Gorton Mount, which is a really, really deprived area. And there is a report that you can read on the implementation of that, where there are some indications that it was problematic in terms of the cultural values and background underlying the two approaches. But I think the issue is you can't take a system like Montessori or Steiner and kind of transplant it into another system. It just, that doesn't work. So if you look at comparing early years in Scandinavian countries with here, it would be really difficult to implement that approach here, because I think our wider cultural values are different to those in those kind of countries. So I think we can learn from these different approaches, and there can be an interchange of ideas, and it's helpful if there's an empirical basis to support that as well. But I don't think you could take one approach and just say, you know, to a national curriculum school, use this approach. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just to add to that, I was interested. I mean, Montessori, of course, was the first qualified female doctor in Europe, I think, and was clearly a brilliant woman. And I think, you know, she was dealing with children who would come from what might be described as chaotic households, I think, these days, in her early work. And so what you get when I visited Montessori schools, you get a real sense of order and calm. And I think for children coming from those kinds of backgrounds, you see why that might be just the right thing, you know, for them to do. Okay, anyway, you're supposed to be answering the question, not me. Yes, Gil.
I was wondering about your pretend play task and the fact that it's quite standardized, and whether you consider whether the use of a more child-initiated pretense task would have shown differences between the two schools.
Definitely, and as I said, I think this study, it was the final study of my PhD, and so I was under some pressure to get it finished, but the main study that I did for my PhD, which was a longitudinal study, did exactly that. So it had a standardised measure of pretense and a free play observational measure as well, because I think it's important to have both of those aspects. But because we were short on time, and also I think it was quite challenging for the Steiner and Montessori schools in terms of going in and doing a standardised test, because that isn't really the ethos behind those systems. So particularly with the language measure that we used, it was a standardised measure where you go through a series of pictures and you mark their responses. So I think in some ways we were mindful of how much time we were spending with the children, and also making sure that it was an enjoyable process for them as well. So it was interesting that I think particularly the children in the Steiner and Montessori schools, every time I went in, not all the children obviously in the classes consented to take part, and often the ones whose parents hadn't consented really wanted to do it, and it was really awkward because I had to say to them, but you can have a look at the materials and things. But I think it was because it was something different. They were interested in it.
I just had a question. I think one of the criteria that you had for play was about originality. Does that also include things like problem solving? Because my experience as a practitioner is that play is a great facilitator of problem solving, and therefore creativity is one channel, but that would go down very naturally.
Yeah, I think the measure that we used focused more specifically upon pretense in terms of civilization. So it was quite limited in that way, and ideally we would have wanted to use a more developed approach, potentially using free play, where you could look at other aspects of play as well. So I didn't really have time to go through it, but one of the other studies that we did was using a different assessment where you provide children with a set of play materials, so specifically some dolls and blocks, and then you record it and code it in terms of things like problem solving or originality. So you have the cognitive aspect, but then also rate it on an emotional aspect as well, because I think one of the things, the lady when you were talking earlier, that I haven't mentioned in this particular talk is the importance of play for social-emotional development and in a therapeutic context as well. So it's interesting, and what this study, we found in this study, which again was a small-scale study, was that the correlation, there was a strong correlation between the cognitive aspect of pretend play and the creativity measure, but there wasn't a significant relationship between the affective or emotional aspect and the creativity, which is interesting because that's vice versa to what's been found in other research. And indeed, but if you're thinking about using play as a form of intervention, then it's quite important to think about, well, what are the active aspects of play that are having the influence?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I found it really fascinating. My question is relating to special needs, and I know that some of the education systems almost don't allow children with additional needs, such as a previous talk I went to with Blue Schools. However, if we were to bring some of these educational ideas into the mainstream, how would we accommodate children with such as autistic spectrum disorder, where we already use the pretend actions tasks in paediatrician referrals. So I don't know how you would incorporate children who already struggle with pretense and bringing it into a more mainstream system.
I think it's interesting that from my experience and from the reading around Montessori and Steiner, they very much are inclusive and do include children with additional learning needs. I think, in fact, in some ways, I think there's been a kind of idea that actually those schooling systems may be more suitable for children with additional learning needs, because with Montessori, you're very much progressing from concrete-based activities towards abstract thought. You're not kind of putting that on children sort of straight away within Key Stage 1. And obviously this is only looking at pretense, and I know pretend interventions can be used with children with autism to facilitate kind of communication and social emotional skills. But I think I agree with a feeling in the literature that actually children with special educational needs would be well suited or well placed within these systems, if only because due to the nature of them, the class sizes are smaller and the attention to individual development is greater. And in some ways it's a shame, because a lot of these ideas, the developmental and educational literature agrees with the underlying philosophy and ideas, but the reality of state schools is that the class sizes, you just, as a teacher, I think you just wouldn't have the time. And I think a lot of time of any teachers in this class in mainstream schools is spent even just trying to control the class, I think, and to make sure that they're on task, etc. So in some ways, I think the smaller classrooms in these alternative education systems have benefits within themselves, and if that could be applicable across state schools, that would be great, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, I don't think.
You have a question over here?
As a full-time state nursery school teacher, we do endeavour to meet individuals' children's needs. I just had two short questions. Just from your sample, were all the children English speakers primarily, or did you have children for whom English was a second language? Because I think I certainly see pretense play that is facilitated because they don't share a language.
That's interesting, because they were all native English speakers, so we were quite careful not to sample any children where English was a second language, because there is a relationship between language and pretense, and the two facilitate each other. That I think to have had children within the sample who were non-English speakers would have been a confounding variable, really.
Okay. Well, from my experience of working with children with many languages, actually it's quite interesting how the play can be far more developed, although there isn't the common language, but play and pretense become the common language between them. My other sort of question and inquiry, because it was a fascinating talk, was I was quite surprised not to hear the word imagination.
I think
anywhere.
I probably should have said at the beginning that I think, I guess talking about pretend play, I think I'd kind of assumed imagination as an aspect of that. So I think pretense, or the idea of literal, non-literal, as if, kind of really links into that imaginative kind of capacity. So I think the terms in the literature kind of vary. So some people refer to pretend play or imaginative play or fantasy play. So I would say that imagination is really a crucial part of pretense, really.
Yeah, because it just wasn't on your list, along with many of the other aspects of imaginative play. And I kind of, as a throw on to that question about imagination, you did talk about having a life experience and some rudimentary knowledge in order to play a role. But actually, children need the freedom to develop imagination so that they can actually play anything, because if they can imagine it,
and
they might be able to do it.
What's interesting is I was doing a lecture this morning with my students and talking about children's imaginary friends. And there was a paper recently that talks about imagination as a fundamental aspect of neurotypical cognition, and how imagination is related to all of these other important abilities like divergent thinking, creativity, memory, and theory of mind as well. So I think I haven't touched upon it in this talk, but I think the relationship between theory of mind and perspective-taking ability and pretense is really interesting. And there's a lot of research, I think that came out of Harvard University, about actors having more developed theory of mind. So when you think about Steiner schools and the amount of role play that they're engaging in, I think it would be really interesting to look at theory of mind abilities in Steiner pupils in particular. I have no idea if that's being looked at or not.
Yes, lady.
I was interested in when you were sort of typifying the national curriculum schools, because in the early years and foundation stage, then there's loads of the kind of play that you're talking about. But by the time they're 8, which is when you measured them, there's not much. So I wondered how you felt that affected your results.
Interestingly, that is something that I didn't mention there, but in the publication of the study, that's one thing that we talk about, that I think because by that point they've been in a more formal based system, it may be that children in the early years actually perform comparatively to Steiner pupils, potentially, but then they lose that advantage over time as they progress into Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. So, I mean, there is evidence, there are some papers that suggest that children's creativity actually reduces as they go through the primary school system. and that would kind of fit in with that argument, which is worrying. The research on children's expressive drawing that some colleagues at Staffordshire University, Richard Jolly in particular, has looked at, is the idea that expressive drawing ability seems to diminish during middle childhood, although it recovers in some individuals who go on to do art. And I think one of those, that kind of links into the cultural learning approach, that we potentially don't place much value on art, not as the fault of the curriculum or the teachers, but potentially because there's so much emphasis upon numeracy and literacy and getting children meeting those criteria, that I think other subjects potentially lose out in that if you've got a spare half an hour, it's not going to be based on an art activity, it's going to be based on doing a numeracy or a literacy activity. But people who teach in primary and secondary, I know what it's like at university, but I'm not sure what the challenges are in terms of primary and secondary education. But I imagine teaching to test is quite probably prevalent.
Anybody else? Any more questions? You want another go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay, fine.
that's right. I was just interested in the comparison between Montessori and Steiner for children with autism, going back to the SEN question, and also yours about the structure and the environment in Montessori. And I just wondered if it would make a really interesting, it is a question, study of the difference for a child with autism in the two, because personally I know friends who've got children with autism have gone to Steiner schools who found it too much. The imaginative aspect wasn't really what they wanted, and the role play wasn't really what they wanted, whether they needed to do it or not. But Montessori would be self-directed, structured, sensory, real life, all those things. And apparently it does work very well for those reasons. So that, I just think that would be a really interesting study as well.
I do as
But
well.
they're all different anyway, so
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. I don't know if you could maybe, I don't know if there's aspects of Montessori that you could potentially incorporate into an intervention approach, because you might not be able to look at the impact of Montessori as a whole upon functioning in autism, but if from a scientific point of view you could maybe test aspects of Montessori in a kind of controlled study. I think that would be really, really interesting, and probably a PhD for someone to do.
Good. Okay. Dave has a question. Okay.
Marisol.
No, we have two more.
Quick.
I've just got a boring statistics question, sorry.
Oh no.
I just wondered why, I might have misread the slide, but it looked like when you showed the creativity scores, the mainstream school had the highest mean, right?
It may be a typo.
So I was just wondering how that was.
Let's have a look. Yeah, I think it is a typo if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
Very eagle-eyed, and I'm glad I didn't get onto the bit about factor analysis, because you probably would have picked me up on that. So I'm glad I didn't get onto the really stats-heavy bit. But yeah, it was an ANCOVE that we did to look at the differences between the three groups, and we entered the covariates as well to control for them. But yeah, I imagine I put that wrong on the slide.
Good to clear that up.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, from your experience observing these classrooms, you spend a little bit of time in each of these settings. So I was wondering, more broadly, what would you think the relationship between play opportunities, so not how well they do in pretence tasks, but how do they get to play within the settings with their general well-being?
I think obviously Steiner incorporates a lot of free play and role play, and it's kind of really kind of developed towards that in terms of serving children's sort of social and emotional development, and the idea that children learn about social relationships through play and appropriate ways to modulate their emotions and things. But I think even though, as Lillard would argue, even though Montessori might not involve pretense specifically, the nature of how they learn and the interaction between different age groups, Lillard argues that itself has the same benefits as pretense. So, for example, if you think about the benefits that you get from learning from other pupils, and when I was in the Montessori schools, they had a particular way of helping children to understand and deal with conflict as well. So again, this may be an aspect of having much smaller class sizes, but if the children had a disagreement, they would actually discuss it with them and ask them to consider the point of view of the other person and really concentrating upon social and emotional development from that point of view. So I don't think it's neglected in Montessori at all, it's just a different way of developing those kind of skills.
I think we have the last question down the front, unless we've got any other takers.
I might have missed it, but was there differences between the groups in terms of their scores on the Ravens? Did you say that?
There were, yes, and I can't remember what the differences were, which isn't very helpful. To give you some kind of background, originally this study, I was looking at differences in language ability as well, and then when we went to try and get it published, it was very difficult to get it published in a quantitative journal because they wanted us to control for particular and match the groups basically. I can't remember what the difference was. I remember there was a difference, but they were all performing within the age boundaries for their age group. So in some ways, the fact that there were differences in the non-verbal abilities weren't particularly meaningful because they were all performing where you would expect them to.
And just out of curiosity, did you look at the relationship between the Raven scores and overall and creativity and pretense?
I can't remember. We did, in the initial study that I did, we looked at the correlations between non-verbal ability, drawing, language and play, and what we found in that study was that the non-verbal abilities did predict drawing, but not any of the other abilities, which was interesting because what we wanted to find in that study was longitudinally what predicted what. So from working with children with autism point of view, if we'd found that the pretend tasks predicted language abilities over time, that would have been really, really interesting and useful for an intervention. But unfortunately we didn't find that. We found that language predicted pretense, which, yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all those. Oh, now I get the microphone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking some very interesting questions, and well done to Julie for being able to answer them all. We're very impressed by it. And I hope you found this an interesting symposium. We'll be having lots more, I'm sure. But I think in the end we also thank Julie again for